I love how Barry gets his speed back at the end of this week's episode of Arrow, even though we're not going to see how that happens until the next episode of Flash. Hey everybody, welcome back to another Primetime Crisis, and today we are talking about the latest episode of Arrow Season 4, titled Canary Cry, because it's a superhero show and we need unnecessary alliteration. So basically what happens in this episode is Laurel died last week, or it's actually been 3 or 4 weeks since Laurel died, and we're back here and we're dealing with the fallout of her death and the battle against Damien Darhk. Now, Damien Darhk's not really in much of this episode. If he's in this episode at all, he may have like one token scene, but that's really about it. Most of the focus of this episode is on Team Arrow and on a imposter Black Canary that's been floating around after the events of a previous episode of Arrow when Damien Darhk was holding all of Oliver's friends hostage. Now, this is actually not as bad as the previous weeks, except it's still got a lot of issues. It's still got lots of poor storytelling. Clearly these writers don't know what they're doing, and clearly these writers have no sense of character consistency or continuity. But a lot of the tone of this and a lot of what the show is attempting to do lands more times than it has in previous episodes, at least this week. It's still not a good episode, but it's an improvement, and the fact that they're able to treat a character's death with actual gravity is good. It doesn't feel as completely contrived and annoying as it was in the previous episode. So basically what happens here is that we open the episode with the funeral of Tommy Merlin from the end of Season 1. This is a weird thing in the show where every now and then we interrupt the flashbacks from 5 years ago to talk about flashbacks from like previous seasons or scenes within previous seasons that we haven't watched before. Back when we found out about Oliver's child with the girl he got pregnant, it interrupted the flow of the island flashback so we could see Oliver's mom and young Oliver dealing with it. And we're doing the exact same thing here, where we're flashing back to Oliver and Laurel after Tommy dies, right before he flies off to Lian-Yu, before we see the opening of Season 2. The annoying thing about it is that none of the actors look like they did 4 years ago, which you can't really blame them, right? Like, it's people age, things change, it's hard to keep that kind of continuity straight. The thing about it that's really glaring, though, is that all of the actors in this episode don't look at all like they did in Season 1, but just a few weeks ago, when we were doing the Flash time travel episode, everyone in that show looked like they did in that episode. The continuity for Flash within those 2 episodes of the Season 1 episode they flashed back to and the Season 2 episode where they ran back in time have really good connections. And this time with Arrow, it really doesn't. It's kind of messy. So we open with Tommy's funeral because this show loves being able to bait you with things. So instead of just opening with the Laurel funeral like we'd expect, they have to frame it with Tommy's. Now, it is ultimately a good idea to bring Tommy back in because Tommy's death is kind of the catalyst for Oliver wanting to become a hero, and the death of Laurel is supposed to signify Oliver's full growth into that Oliver has become a changed person, and now that he's faced with the same thing again, he has to be able to handle it differently. That's at least what the episode's trying to say, and we'll get to why it doesn't work at all a little bit later. Part of why this episode works is the acting. I mentioned in the previous Arrow review that Paul Blackthorne and Stephen Amell, when they're talking about Laurel's death or when they just see each other and they acknowledge it, they play it so well. Paul Blackthorne in this episode is phenomenal. It's the best performance I think he's ever given in this series, maybe ever. Him reeling with the fact that his daughter died, the fact that he's lost 2 children now, the fact that this is a universe of impossibilities, and the fact that he can't deal with something as natural and as human as the death of his child because of the nature of the world he lives in and the people he interacts with, particularly when you look at Damien Darhk and he's got magical powers. He's having a very hard time accepting it. He's having a very hard time coming to terms with it, and he plays it really, really well. All of his dialogue, all of his heartbrokenness really comes through. It does still open up the issue of post or during season 3 when he had his heart condition, I guess that's just suddenly cured now because there's no signs of it. You'd think that Laurel wanting to protect his heart in the previous season would carry over here, and that he might have a heart attack or something, realizing that his daughter's dead, but he doesn't. We just don't address that at all. We just forget about it. But whatever, I'll let it slide just because we got a really good performance out of Paul Blackthorne. And then we have the imposter Black Canary, kind of. Basically what happens is that there's another character who we never saw from an episode where Oliver's friends were kidnapped by Damien Dark, and this woman thinks that the Green Arrow has failed everyone, and so she has that, she riffs on the you failed the city thing by saying it to him, and she uses Black Canary's costume and Canary Cry device to go out and attack the city. And while she's doing that and Oliver has to deal with that, Diggle is absolutely furious at the fact that he let Laurel die because he wouldn't listen to Oliver's concerns over his brother. And in this episode we finally acknowledge that Andy had a family, that they just name drop here. That doesn't fix any of the stuff we got previous episodes, but they do name drop them. And some of that's interesting, some of that works. You can see very naturally why every character would feel like they need to blame themselves, but it leads to some really awkward scenes. Like there's a scene where Diggle, in his stupid helmet, goes to attack Damien Dark's wife, and Oliver stops him. And right there in public with their voice modifications where they're like sounding like they're growling, they are having a yelling match with each other, and it's really unnecessarily funny. They just keep yelling at the top of their lungs. It's like the Christian Bale Batman voice, but worse. Like they're just screaming and gargling their words, and it's supposed to be emotional, but it doesn't play because they sound so ridiculous. So that doesn't really work. Now, like I said, the idea of everyone blaming themselves is a good idea. The problem is everyone in this show is so self-centered and so inconsistent with their character arcs. No one really grows, no one really learns anything, that the self-pity has kind of just become a staple of the show and not an actual character thing. Lance, throughout this whole episode, while he's dealing with his daughter's death, he's not sitting there talking about how he could have made it different or how he could have changed things or how he could have been there for her. He's not talking about that. His more selfish need comes from, Laurel was my rock. Laurel was the woman that was there for me when I went through alcoholism and when I thought Sarah died and when I lost my wife and all that stuff. He's thinking about Laurel as the relationship those two had and the humanity that they shared with each other, the thing that he can't ever get back, that abstract emotional connection. And everyone else is just doing the stereotypical, well, I could have stopped it thing. No one's talking about Laurel as a hero. No one's talking about Laurel as a person they knew. They're just talking about how they could have stopped it. And it's like the emotional weight of her death hasn't really hit anyone yet, or the show is just doing a really bad job of being able to convey that because we have so many token deaths and resurrections in the show that when it's attempting to be more serious about one, it just doesn't play. A lot of that doesn't really work, and I wish it did, because all the actors are, for the most part, turning in a really good performance. Thea's doing a good job, Felicity's doing a good job as much as I hate her, Oliver's doing a really good job as much as he's kind of just monosyllabic throughout these last few episodes. They're all turning in good performances. It's just, the show has lost me to such a degree that it's really inconsistent as to whether or not this death is really impacting them the way it ought to, because I know this show, and I know it's not going to deal with the meaning of this as much as it should. And that all comes down to the ending. So the ending of this episode is the thing that we have been teased with since the very beginning, which is the funeral for Laurel. Basically, what happens is that no one can know Dinah or Laurel is Black Canary. So there is this weird convenient lie that Laurel was at the prison during the riots to do a deposition of Damien Dark, which is just bull. I mean, obviously, no one's going to believe that, but they say it anyway. And while this other Black Canary is running around attacking the mayor, there's like the ongoing plot thread of like, oh no, this woman's ruining Black Canary's legacy. And so Oliver at the funeral for Laurel decides to out Laurel and says that Laurel Lance was the Black Canary, and everyone sees it, and he has this speech about heroism and sacrifice and such, and it's an okay speech, but that's kind of what they deal with, is like what the legacy of these characters are outside of their selfishness and such. And so that's interesting, right? Like the thing this episode was trying to be all the way through for about 42 out of its 43 minutes, what this episode was trying to do was say that these characters have grown from their initial mistakes, that they're not dealing with these things the way they used to, that they have become heroes. And then you get to the scene in the car with Felicity. Now, this is when the whole thing falls apart. This is one of those scenes that ruins an episode, because if you just cut it off a minute early, this episode would have been good. This episode would have been one of the better episodes of this series if you just cut it off 1 minute early. So, if you remember, we kept getting teased with the who died, what happened, the funeral, all that stuff. And we know it wasn't Felicity at one point because we got a flash forward where Oliver gets in the car and Felicity's like, you have to kill him. And then Oliver's like, yes, I'm going to kill Damien Dark. And so we're like, oh my god, whatever's happened has driven Oliver over the deep end. Well, this whole episode is about how Oliver isn't going to go over the deep end, how Oliver has to stay grounded, how Oliver is supposed to keep the hope alive. That was the whole point of Laurel's last couple episodes, of Oliver needs to stay who he is, or else all of what they're doing is in vain. And because they need to keep consistent with that scene, Oliver sits in the car with Felicity, and he's like, yeah, I'm going to kill Damien Dark. This is awful. Everything sucks. And it makes everyone completely unsympathetic, because now they haven't learned their lesson. This whole episode was about how they've all learned their lesson and how they've all grown as people, and then you get to the end, and no, they haven't learned their lesson. Why does Oliver need to stop Diggle from killing the mayor, who is in league with Damien Dark, if Oliver's just going to kill Damien Dark anyway? Like, his whole excuse by the end of this is just, well, at this point it's not convenient for me. His entire arc falls apart, and it was a bad arc to begin with. Like, Oliver is one of the most inconsistently written characters on television. And then you get to this episode that's supposed to say he's grown, and I could have buried everything else under the rug if this episode had really turned him into a hero, and it doesn't. You can't make these two episodes about how Oliver needs to keep the hope alive and what Laurel symbolizes when all of that's completely out the window in the last minute of it. So that ending really ruins it. The ending is absolutely the worst part, and I wish I could be more quippy and sarcastic about this episode, but the truth is it's really somber, it's really sad. There are moments where it's trying to slow down and be human. The problem is it's not consistent with anything that came before it, and all the potential it was building up to make itself better is completely lost by the end. So now it's just an episode that exists in a void. It's just another episode with good scenes independent of its context. So this is more sad than it is bad. It's more of just, I'm seeing every now and then the glimmers of what these writers used to do. I'm seeing every now and then the glimmers of what this show used to be. It was never brilliant. It was at points pretty good. And we almost got back there with this. We almost did it, and it went nowhere. The flashbacks with Laurel and Oliver before he goes off to Lanyu in between seasons 1 and 2 are okay. They don't really add much. They're supposed to be part of that character arc of Oliver learning to internalize the hope, and he completely misses the point by the end, so why bother even talking about it? So I'm interested to see where the rest of the season goes. I really hope the next episode is no, Oliver was just exaggerating and it's just a cliffhanger bait and switch thing, that Oliver really will internalize the character arc. But the way this episode ends, it's just, I'm pretty sure that's not going to happen. So let me know what you guys think in the comments of this episode, whether you agree or disagree with anything I said. How do you think this season's going to pan out? Oliver keeps talking about how he's dealt with this magic before on the island. Does anyone have any predictions as to what it is? If it's related to anything comic booky, it'd be really cool if it's connected to Dr. Fate, because we have Dr. Fate we have Dr. Fate's helmet in Constantine, and Constantine was in this show, so it'd be fun to make all that connect again. But given how badly this show handles most of his characters, maybe I shouldn't throw in one of my favorites. So let me know what you guys think in the comments, and I think we are pretty much consistent up to the end of the season at this point. So I will see you again next week with another episode of Arrow.